This is Aquatic Plastic,
a podcast about rivers and seas, water pollution and innovative solutions.
Stories of people who like their water clean and fresh so much that they are ready to work for it day and night. Today we are about to meet a reporter, a writer, a filmmaker and a familyman all in one. He, just like the Vikings centuries ago, navigated the Danube River upstream from the Black Sea to the Black Forest.
So for me, the Danube, the Tisza, the Lake Balaton here in Hungary, these are all substitute oceans in a way for the Atlantic Ocean or the English Channel.
In the first episode of Aquatic Plastic, our guest is Nick Thorpe, who was born by the river Medway in the UK and now lives on the right bank of the river Danube in Budapest, Hungary.
It's easy to get obsessed with compost toilets because we're taking responsibility for the plastic and the waste we're using. We're taking responsibility for what we eat, but what about taking responsibility as well for our toilet system?
With Nick, we are going to discover our multiple connections to rivers, discuss what rivers provide for us, and what we give back in return.
I write my books in the present tense as well, because I think that helps bring things alive.
Dear Aquatic Plastic people cleaning beaches, rivers and seas all around the world, it's Attila Dávid Molnár
and Gary Henko, two plastic pirates calling you on the radio waves from the Danube River Basin, Europe. In this episode we talk to Nick Thorpe about his obsessions to rivers, writing and filmmaking.
Aquatic Plastic is brought to you by the Interact Danube Region program co-funded by the European Union. Let's tune in to the first episode of Aquatic Plastic.
Nick Thorpe is a British journalist and documentary filmmaker born in 1960 in Upnor, Kent, by the River Medway. He studied at Sherborne School, then came the University of Reading, followed by the University of Dakar in Senegal, then the University of Freiburg, Germany.
Since 1986 he is a Budapest correspondent who not only travels but actually lives here, reporting to papers like The Observer, Guardian, The Independent and of course the BBC. He's a renowned filmmaker. Made in 1986, the Faroe Island was documenting the last days of the intact Szigetköz archipelago of the river Danube between Slovakia and Hungary. His latest film series, The Danube Against the Flow, is broadcasted all around the world.
In 2016, he was the co-recipient of the Peabody Award Public Service category for host contributions to the programs on the European migrant crisis. In this episode we talk about rivers, history, migration and minorities, pollution and solution, and of course, the aquatic plastics.
Dear Nick, thank you for accepting our invitation. Welcome on board. You gave your wonderful voice to some of my early films, and you also appeared as a guest in the predecessor of this very podcast, the Hungarian Plastic Pirate Radio on Spotify. So we know each other, I think, well, and probably you won't take this question as an offense, but what are you unofficially? Are you a traveler? Are you a migrant? Are you a minority?
I've always been a traveler. I used to call that almost a profession before I became a journalist, but I wouldn't call myself just a journalist because I don't like isms, journalism either, and there's a kind of a beauty of traveling. I wouldn't call myself a tourist either because of this tourism thing. I think of myself nowadays more as a writer and a filmmaker. That gives me more time to think, to reflect on those travels and to kind of target my travels beyond where, the everyday politics of living in Hungary or Central Europe might take me. So, and as you say, kindly, I was born on the shore of a small river in Britain, the Medway, and then later, for a lot of my life in Britain, I lived beside the sea. So for me, the Danube, the Tisza, the Lake Balaton here in Hungary, these are all substitute oceans in a way for the Atlantic Ocean or the English Channel.
Now you live in Budapest, but you spent your childhood years in up north, UK, I hope I pronounce it well, on the banks of the River Medway. And I googled it up and learned that from Sir Francis Drake, who learned sailing on the river, to World War German U-boats, to even Roman relics. This river is very rich in history. So were you aware of this as a kid, and how this river, Medway, prepared you for your journeys on the Danube?
I was very small when we lived there. We moved away when I was still very young. But what I do remember, one of my very first memories was the smell of the river. As a child, I guess I must still have been in my pram, but that astonishing smell that you also get with the Danube or the Tisa of, it's not exactly rotting, but it's of seaweed, of mud. It's not a very romantic smell, but it's a smell I like very much. It makes me feel at home. It's a good start. It's similar, of course, to the smell of the seashore with all the seaweed and so on, and that salty smell that you get with British rivers anyway, because you're never very far from the sea, even beside a river in Britain. So there's this aspect of the scent or the smell of the river, but also Upner, which very few people even in Britain have ever heard of. So it's a tiny village, and I was born at home in a little house in a very steep street, which is a little bit like Gulbaba Street in Budapest, so a very narrow, steep, cobbled street. It was also the site of one of the biggest defeats ever, the biggest disasters which struck the British Royal Navy when, I think it was the 17th century, the Dutch, during the night, Dutch attackers sailed up the Medway and set fire to the entire British fleet while people were asleep. They weren't expecting this, a surprise attack. And so over the fireplace in my parents' house, there was this etching, this picture of the British fleet burning. So perhaps that sort of led me into journalism a bit. There might be some connection there that's, this sense of conflict of an island nation in some way, if not at war, but at least in a situation of tension with, or somehow different to other countries. Maybe that had some influence, maybe not.
And thanks for mentioning Lake Balaton. It really influenced my whole childhood, and maybe that's why I became an environmentalist, because I remember the smell as well and the cleanness of the lake. And my question is, why you decided to travel and paddle and cycle all along the Danube? Why the Danube?
Why the Danube? I hesitated, I have to say, because it's such a big river. It's such a massive, long river. And I wondered when I first had the idea if I kind of dared. Because also, in a way, it's not my river. It belongs to 6 or 7 or 8 or perhaps, at one extent, 10 nations or peoples who live beside it. And I'm always a stranger here in some sense, though I live a couple of 100 meters away from it. And I think you have to be quite bold. It's a brave move to take someone else's river and sort of claim it for yourself. Of course, I haven't pushed anyone else away from it. I'd rather like to attract more people to use it. The cyclists, of course, the international cyclists are the people who use it very well. They're the only other people I've met on my travels up and down the Danube who really kind of appreciate it as a long river. Other people here in Budapest cross it every day on a tram or a bus. It's the same in Serbia, in Romania, in Bulgaria, in Croatia. People kind of cross it. People who live beside it don't tend to ever really know the other sections of it. If they travel away from it. They don't travel up and down it, except, as I say, the honourable exception of the cyclists. But then, having got the idea, I liked it because it does, this sounds like a cliche, but it's true, it does connect peoples. It connects so many countries. I know the Volga is a slightly longer geographical river, but it's all in Russia. And therefore it's it's very important ecologically for Russia and the Russian people, but somehow the Danube is it belongs to more people, and it's always been a route of migration as well. As I was travelling up the river, and I was normally on the shore of the river, I did very little of the journey by boat. And of course, I've done it twice, once for the book and another time in 2020 for the film series I made about it. I noticed that, in fact, when you're travelling on the shore, most people are going my way upriver, coming upriver. They might be traders, they might be migrants, people from Eastern Europe seeking a better life in richer Western Europe or a better paid life in Western Europe. So many invasions took place up the river. The Turks came up the river, but also civilizations came upriver. The great late Neolithic civilizations around Lepenski Vir, for example, in Serbia. So all in all, there were just so many reasons to write about the river Geri. Once I decided it wasn't a sort of a journey with the book or the film series that it began, but it can't really end. I still feel I'm just beginning to discover it. I'm sort of sensitive to anything that happens on the Danube. It might be the disaster, when the Hobleyan, the mermaid boat with many South Korean tourists, died some years ago in the Danube in Budapest. So it's not I don't want to over-romanticize the Danube. It's also, a polluted river sometimes. At its worst, it's a flush toilet, taking away or sweeping all the rubbish of Eastern Europe, of Central Europe, of bits of Western Europe towards the Black Sea. But at the same time, it's a magnificent river. It's never been killed. It's really never been destroyed. It's still a living river. And I think it provides a great deal of energy to all the peoples who live beside it. It energizes the landscape. It energizes the peoples who live beside it. So it has a very positive effect in the modern world as it had in the ancient world.
Your book about the Danube became really the ultimate hand guide. And I dare to say it's a kind of a Bible of river lovers and nature enthusiasts now in this river basin. And what I'm interested in, that most people take rivers as obvious things. Like the river is there, you have to cross it, as you said. But how did you come up with the idea to approach the Danube as a living creature and fill up the book with a river like this?
Obviously, any river or any landscape has a certain character, a personality. And the longer you spend with it, the more you get to know that personality. One of the questions I put to myself as I travelled upriver was, is the Danube male or female? And obviously there are some hints about this. In German, die Donau is clearly feminine. But if you look at the Roman statues that you find near the river, they, for reasons of their own, tended to portray Danubius as a male god. I think, in my experience, as I engaged with the personality of the Danube, I thought more often than not it's a she. But sometimes in some of its moods it becomes a he, and I think in the modern world we're used to having multiple identities and waking up one morning and sometimes feeling more like one thing or another. Also, the question of the age, not just the gender of the Danube. It can sometimes feel like, of course, especially in the early morning, but in some places on the river as well, perhaps in the delta sometimes, it's a very young river, as though it's just been invented or created or flown out of somewhere this morning. Of course, also in the Black Forest in Germany, there's that sense of it being a very young river there for obvious reasons, and there you have this statue in Donaueschingen near the source of the river of the Danube as a young woman, as a young girl, even. So there are all these kind of aspects and faces of it. I'm not sure I've answered the question.
Partly you did, but what interests me a lot is that did you start out with this concept, or was it formed by people you met along the way? Because I'm just really interested in that.
Both, really. I mean, I do regard myself as someone who cares a great deal about the environment and who is very worried about climate change, the future of life on this planet. And it upsets me very much nowadays to see how much building is going on along the shore of Lake Balaton, for example, the cutting down of reeds, the sort of almost uncontrolled development of housing estates or holiday homes along the shores of the river. I mean, obviously you see that as well on the Danube. There have been massive interventions over the centuries to regulate the river. But really, to answer your question, you know, it's a huge question, and I'm struggling to answer it properly, Arti. But I think on the one hand, it's the way I see the world. I do think a sense of place, of geography, is very important, and that we who live in a world where more and more people live in cities and relate to a street or a particular building, we're in danger of losing that sense of home, of geography, which is separate from any, you know, kind of political connotations. This is much deeper than something political, although perhaps the more national or nationalist-minded parties are better at talking about it because they're more defensive about the territorial limits of their particular countries, and perhaps the more liberal or left-wing-minded people need to remember how important it is to the human soul to be able to relate to a certain place on the planet, to feel at home somewhere, but also, therefore, to feel sympathy to those who've been expelled or forced to leave their homes as economic migrants or as refugees. So that's, you know, I don't want to make any kind of political speech, but inevitably the Danube runs through these issues nowadays of identity, of home, and of belonging. And I think it's a good thing to feel at home somewhere, to belong somewhere, or if we have to leave our homes, to feel at home wherever we are. You know, when I make a fire, as I have often on my travels, on the shore of the river Danube, on the beach, maybe to cook some fish in Sigetkas in Hungary or Čolokas, Žitný Ostrov in Slovakia, then I feel at home where I have a fire. And if there's a river flowing a few meters away and I may be eating something that's come out of the river, so much the better. I feel very much at home then.
Gary, I think you remember very recently we were in Ukraine. Gary is responsible for all plastic cup activities in Ukraine. And there we met a bishop, I think he was.
Yes.
And do you remember what he said about his nationality? I mean, it was amazing when we talked to him, and he said with the war going on and with all the international conflicts, he found himself in a very difficult position to define himself, and he came up with a solution. Now it rings a bell?
Yeah, that we are all living on the same river basin.
Yeah. And he said, I am
sharing the same river.
Yeah, sharing the same river. And he said, word by word, I am an Upper Tisa citizen. That's what he said. And since then, I feel like I'm relieved. It's like this. I don't know. He was a bishop. I don't know about his.
Yes. He was the bishop. He was at
Uzhgorod. Yeah. And since then, I am blessed because I do not have to carry this load of. I'm Hungarian in Ukraine, and I have to be responsible for our politicians or what they said or what they do. No, I am a Danubian citizen, a middle Danubian citizen, with strong strong connections to the Tisza as well.
Yeah, it was a really important sentence you mentioned about the river. Yeah, that we are losing the connection, and yeah, I think the same, that we are turning our back to our rivers. Meanwhile, we are drinking its water every day. Especially here in Budapest, we are drinking the water of the Danube, but we are polluting every day, 24/7. And I'm really interested in what you experienced along the Danube, from the delta till the source. Was it changing the pollution? Because as I know, the wastewater pollution becomes more severe after Hungary. So it's in Serbia, Romania, and Bulgaria pollutes a bit more. But we are adding a lot of trash and industrial pollution, agricultural pollution. But I never traveled all along the Danube, so I'm really interested. What was your experience?
Obviously, one sees a lot of rubbish on the shore, of things thrown away, of waste, whether plastic bottles or broken glass or whatever. I remember, for example, where the Siret River flows into near I think the town, or near the city of Galați in Romania. So near the delta, not quite in the delta. The sheer quantity of plastic flowing into the Danube there, just on its last legs, really. I also remember being with reed cutters in the delta who, in order to mark where in the delta, where it's dangerous to tread, where it was very deep, they had made this kind of pond of plastic bottles floating on the surface. They were using the plastic to mark to themselves where it was dangerous to tread. A little bit of open water that when they were sort of working, cutting the reeds, they wouldn't otherwise have noticed. So I have sort of flashes of memories of the pollution in different places, the plastic, the surface, the floating and washed up on the shore, the kind of drift pollution that one sees. But also I was quite keen on my journeys up the river to swim at every opportunity. And obviously when you're immersing yourself in the water and sometimes getting a mouthful of it, it crosses your mind, what am I drinking here? You mentioned at the beginning kindly that I spent 6 months living in West Africa. I actually got very sick when I swam in the river Niger in Mali, near Timbuktu, because I swam in the river. We just crossed the Sahara Desert. I was very, very hot, and it was such a relief to be in water again. We just tore off our clothes having crossed the Sahara Desert and swam out into mid-current, and I must have drunk something there. I had terrible dysentery for weeks after that. So I am aware of the dangers of swimming in rivers and of drinking from rivers directly. But I was also aware, travelling upriver, of how much work is being done, how much money has been invested, for example, by the European Union, which is terrible organisation at mentioning its own achievements. But, the big sewage works, the new sewage works on Chepel Island in Budapest, the sewage works in Vienna, and of course in other many towns and cities up and down the Danube, funded often by the European Union. It's one of the sort of unsung successes of the EU and of the different countries up and down it to improve the situation in some ways. Obviously, there are issues. The nuclear power station in Hungary, at Pocz, the nuclear power station in Romania at Cernavodă, the shortage potentially in future of cooling waters, as that water is taken from the river and then in the heat of summer being pumped back in. They're supposed to close down those reactors if, in Paksh, of course, if it goes, the water temperature downriver from the effluent, the cooling where the waters flow back into the river, if it goes over, I think it's 30 degrees centigrade. There have been various studies which suggest they don't always do that. So these issues which, we'll have to, face in future in terms of the safety of the waters. Also talking to fishermen up and down, I spoke to so many anglers on the shore, and even in Budapest, which one would expect is a pretty polluted city, there are guys down there, very silent people. It's actually quite hard to interview anglers because they're not men. It's pretty much always men. Well, occasionally a woman. Like Balaton, I see sometimes women fishing occasionally, but it's mostly men. They're pretty silent people. The anglers and the ferrymen, interestingly, are the most silent people, the hardest people, in my experience, to get into conversation with. But anyway, they would show me what fish they'd caught that day, if they'd caught fish. In Serbia, I remember catfish in particular, and anglers there showing me these kind of wooden sticks which they beat on the surface. There's a special word in Hungarian, I can't remember it, when you beat the surface of the water and it sounds like the tail of a fish flapping on the top of the water, and it attracts other fish there. So
is the kutyva, and kutyogatash, we say it's kuty. It's a word that resembles the sound, and it attracts a predatory fish, mostly catfish. Because the catfish thinks another catfish is taking its prey, because most often they suck their prey from the surface, and then it gives a bubbly sound. And the kutyva imitates that very successfully. And it's a very ancient tool. It has origins deep in Asia, as I've read in one of the books of Otto Hermann. And I'm very happy that you mentioned that there are people with very strong connections to the river, and trying to speak to them and to ask them gives you a feedback of what is happening with the river. And in your book, there is I would say a figure that has nearly stepped out of a magical realism book, this Marko Pogacnik. I hope I pronounce his name well, from Slovenia. And I felt there happened something very interesting. Can you just please give us an...
Yeah, he's Marko Pogacnik. He's a man who... he calls himself a geomancer. He tries to use the theory or concept of acupuncture to heal damaged landscapes, and they could be damaged by pollution or by human pollution, by war or conflict. For example, he in Northern Ireland, close to the border between the south and the north, so a place where there have been a lot of conflict, so basically in my own country or near my own country, he positions rocks or stones like the acupressure points on the landscape to try and heal a damaged landscape. He did that in war zones, and I knew I have friends who know him, I knew he was going to be in Szentendre on the Danube, and we had a very interesting conversation over a few glasses of wine, I have to say, with him about this personality of the Danube. And the question I was asking him, as someone who is sensitive to the spirit of place, the spirit of rivers, he talks to fairies, he talks to trees, he talks to rivers, he listens to what they're saying, their conversations with each other, which I'm happy to believe in an age of science or pseudoscience. I'm happy to listen to someone who's got his ear to the ground, as it were, or his ear to the river. And the question I put to him, which I don't think the BBC would have broadcast, is what state is the river in? What does the river tell you about itself? If you could interpret for me how the river is, how sick or how well the river is. And he said basically the Danube is better than you might think. And that even in a city like Budapest, which has been regulated, if you think, a river ought to have beaches, it should have mud flats, it should have stones and creeks, but it's really been disconnected in a city like Budapest, partly because of the flood protection since the great floods of 1838, which flooded half of Pest. So with all this kind of concrete or stone or rock built on the sides of the river, to what extent is it still living? And he was, as I say, rather reassuring that he says that really that the river, that rivers in general are rather robust, that they survive a lot of what we do to them. Of course, they're wounded by our disrespect for them, for the rubbish or waste that we throw into them, for the pollutants, the human sewage, the industrial or agricultural flows that pump into them. These things are harmful to them, but one should not underestimate the immune system, the natural immunity of a river, its ability to recover. I remember, just as a very scientific example, when there was the spillage from the gold works in Baia Mare, Nagy Banya, into the Somes River, the Lapus River, eventually into the Tisa. How many fish died suddenly? And some people at that time said the Tisa River would not recover for 100 years. In fact, despite all that damage, despite the horrors of that, the sad scenes of fishermen fishing the sort of corpses of giant fish, of catfish, whatever, carp out of the river, it actually recovered pretty soon. So talking to Pogacnik, that was one of the big impressions I had. It was a rather optimistic view that rivers are more robust, they're more muscular, their immune system is stronger. He also told me one very interesting story, which was sort of on my mind as I was travelling upriver, which is that which way do rivers flow? Because one has a sense, of course, scientifically and logically, that rivers flow from a fixed point at their source, collecting more tributaries as they flow and end up in the sea, one sea or another. But there's this beautiful poem by Friedrich Hölderlin in German, Der Ister, the old Greek name for the Danube, in which he says there, in English translation, but I think it must flow from the east. So this sense that there's a kind of what one sees, which is with any river, the actual flow of it, which is obviously, downstream, but there's also a sense of every river that there's something else going on upstream as well. And I've spoken to people who kayak a lot in the Danube. Obviously, they kayak, they tend to, travel near the shore where the flow is less. But they've sworn to me, and I met a Hungarian couple of years ago who kayaked the whole way up, that they actually weren't going against the flow all the way there, and they got to know where to find places where even it was flowing the other way. But Pogacnik has this vision of all rivers flowing the wrong way as well as flowing the right way, as it were. And he actually pointed out in Budapest that near Gellert Hill, close to where I live, that what he's watched or noticed is that the river seems to sort of be flowing down through Budapest, past Gellert Hill, and then it seems there's a sort of reverse flow back from Gellert Hill as far as Castle Hill or back towards the Chain Bridge or something. I don't know how much that's his vision of the river or how much it's, geomorphically proven, scientifically proven, but it's a very interesting aspect. And so I got a lot from that conversation with Marko Pogacnik.
Yeah, I can underline that because Gary very recently started their waste collection project, and the very same site.
Yes. Actually, the litter trap what we used, it was on that spot.
On that spot.
Yes.
And we can absolutely underline that the river is trying to take off her load at that position and wants to take a second round, as you wrote in your book, towards the Hungarian plains.
That's right, sort of taking a deep breath and sort of pulling itself back, ready for that rush down across the flatlands.
Indeed. I don't know if you are aware of the ocean literacy principles, Nick, that started in the US, then reshaped our thinking about the seas, and finally changed the EU and UN legislation, recommendation and policy considering water issues. Here I just a little, I would say a little spot advertising for a recommendation paper that Gary was editing or writing very recently, and talking to stakeholders. And what I am sure of is that your book, the Danube book, is about river literacy and the multiple ways the river influences our lives, and vice versa. We as humans impact the life of the river and also its inhabitants. So let me ask, what do you see that what the river gives us in return? We pollute the river, we put plastic in it, but what the river gives us in return, and if you can please just name a few particular things, because your book is full of such river treasures.
I mean, obviously on a practical level, it gives, drinking water, it irrigates the fields either side, it changes people's lives. It gives people a break in their lives from the rush. So it's really, I've spoken to people who were in prison, for example, in Vats, who found it a great source of consolation. I've spoken to a Turkish tailor in the city of Ulm, who feels that the Danube connects him to his city on the northern shore of Turkey, on the Black Sea, that this body of water flowing past his home in Germany, where he moved, 40 or so years ago, he still can go out each morning and look at that river and feel connected to Samsun in Turkey. I've spoken to Chechens who came as asylum seekers, as refugees to Austria, who, living in exile in Western Europe, they are unable to travel back to Chechnya. And when they heard that, I think, the woman's father had died, and somehow she went down to the river to cry, and so the river there was consoling her, had a great sort of power of consolation, and because the river is kind of eternal, it always acts in that way. It's beyond time, it's outside time. The civilizations come and go, our lives come and go on its shore. The Roman Empire came and went, but it's kind of all still there. Is that what you meant with the question, or was it something more prosaic?
I think it was more spiritual, but I absolutely agree that these are the most important things that we get from rivers. I mean, like fresh water, like you drink now, and also these contemplating moments. But I was just so amazed to read in your book that the very first expert item of the Carpathian Basin, the obsidian, has traveled by the Danube up and down. And also the very same river system, the Tisza and the Bodrog River, is giving us the wine that Hungary is, I think, most famous of, the Tokai region, the special microclimate. So I'm just impressed about that you could give other things to this list.
Yes, I mean, yeah, I could talk a lot about the wine. One of the beauties of traveling long distance is the hospitality that one meets on the way. And actually, a British friend of mine, a priest, he actually wrote a sermon once for his parish church in a small village based on my Danube book, on the idea of hospitality. And he went through my book with a pencil, I hope, not a pen, marking every example of hospitality. I can't remember if he ever actually sort of added them up, but how many times I'd been offered a glass of wine, a cup of coffee, a meal, a fish dinner, a plate of cakes on my birthday or whatever on the journey. So it does have this sense, which I think is stronger still in Central and Eastern Europe than in Western Europe often. Often poorer communities are more generous towards strangers, which sounds strange because, of course, Eastern Europe maybe has a reputation sometimes in Western Europe as a place of, nationalisms or of xenophobia or whatever. Certainly on my travels, the hospitality I encountered from many people I met was enormous. So that's not just a kind of, it's easier to imagine beside a river somehow than a long way from a river. I think a river, there's something about a river, like a mountain, in fact, which reminds people that they're just humans, whatever identity they've adopted at that particular time. And so the stranger can take refuge there or get offered, at the very least, a glass of water when they're travelling through. Also, there's something about a river which is a kind of and obviously I exploited this mercilessly in my book. It's a source of stories. The people have got a little bit more time near a river, or the river takes them out of time, perhaps, and they're more likely to tell you tales from their own life related to the river or not. There was one particular case when I'm cycling up the river next to the river in Hungary, and suddenly I see in the middle of nowhere a little kind of pavilion has been set up where they're about to serve beer with a barrel of beer. And just as I'm sort of taking in the scene and trying to chase away a dog which is barking around my ankles, a huge river cruise liner pulls up on the shore. All the people get off it and they're heading straight for this little white tented pavilion on a hot summer's day, and they're going to start drinking beer there. So I think, well, I'm thirsty, maybe I can get some beer too. So I wheel my bicycle over there, and it turns out this is a trip for dozens, perhaps hundreds of they're retired men who'd served in the US Navy on nuclear submarines, and their wives. Right. So these are men and women in their 70s and 80s who the men in particular on the submarines had spent weeks, months, years of their lives underwater, deep underwater, under the Arctic, about to take part in the Third World War, to start the Third World War. One of the men had a tattoo on his arm of missiles coming up through the ice at the North Pole, which obviously would have been fired towards the Soviet Union in August 1960, when I would have been, 6 months old, living in this small village of Upner near London. We would have been burnt to ashes by the retaliation to those missiles. So here I am, cycling up the Danube, and I'm suddenly talking to these men from submarines, from nuclear submarines, drinking beer beside the river. If I'd met them in a bar in Budapest, or if I'd met them in a bar in Birmingham, for that matter, I don't think they would have opened up like that and told me those stories. It was somehow because it was something the Danube kind of encouraged them to speak. It sort of opened their mouth and it opened my ears in a kind of interesting alchemical reaction. And that happened all the time. And obviously as a storyteller, as a collector of stories myself, that was rather important and useful.
You are leaving us speechless.
Yeah, speechless. But you mentioned war, you mentioned hospitality, and it brings me back to Transcarpathia, our favorite part of River Tisa. And I was wondering and thinking about our good friend Béla Franz. He's our pioneer there, who is cleaning up the source of the Tisa, at Black Tisa and White Tisa as well. And
from plastic pollution.
From plastic pollution, and we haven't seen him a long time ago, but
because of the war.
Because of the war, and sooner or later he will visit us, or we will visit him. But we keep continuing our cleanups and work. 3 projects are ongoing in Transcarpathia. We are lobbying internationally, visiting different cities, conferences, roundtables, basically all around the world. And when we are showing what they are doing on a daily basis, how they are living, how they are tackling not just the plastic pollution, but the industrial pollution as well, I think is really heartbreaking. And Danube is the most international river in the world. I think 19 countries are sharing its river basin. I'm really curious. What can you suggest us? What's your advice for us? How we can tackle these transboundary issues of pollution? Because you have seen a lot around the globe,
and you also cross borders mentally.
Yes,
like a river.
I'm happy you mentioned Béla Franz, because I've got to know him as well with my latest book project, which is about the Carpathian Mountains. It's a continuation, in a way, of my Danube book, asking the same question: where does all this water come from? And that took me to Transcarpathia, Carpathalia, to Yasinia, the town of Yasinia, Kurosmeze in Hungarian, and there I met Béla, not even knowing at that point that he's a friend of yours, someone who's collaborated, is working with you. So that was it was nice to be talking about you, Ati, there, in as Béla ran around, that workshop, that astonishing workshop he has right on the shore of the Black Tisa in Yasinia, and seeing just how I remember he told me, and this is fresh in my mind because I've only just finished this book. It's not published yet. It will be published, later this year or next. He was telling me how he got the idea of trying to deal with waste in the Tisa, which was, I'm sure you know this story, he was swimming, I think, with his son in the Tisa one day, and a plastic bag was caught up on his body as he was swimming in the Tisa, and he had a sort of revelation, really, a moment of, this is terrible, that this stuff is kind of drifting down it all the time. Why is it? And he came to Hungary, he studied different models of municipal waste management in Hungary and went back there and tried to apply those methods because, it's partly, as he put it, a mentality problem locally. People not just throwing stuff away carelessly, but actually where they don't have proper municipal waste systems, taking their sack of weekly or monthly household waste down to the shore of the river and just literally thinking that the river will take it away, using the Tisa tragically as a kind of dustbin, as a thing to flush it away and not think about it anymore. So I think in terms of advice to you, I think people should be looking to you for advice rather than me offering extra advice here. If one looks everywhere, I was so impressed by Bela's work, dealing with the question of people's mentality, but also working with the local council to find vehicles which could go up into those narrow river valleys above the Black Tissa and go from door to door, so that, basically to take people's rubbish away, people's waste away, encouraging people to compost in rural economies, to compost their food waste, for example. He said I remember Bela telling me it's a crime in a village in the Carpathians to be putting, apple peel, potato peel into the rubbish bin. And if you're paying someone to take it away by the cubic meter, your waste, how stupid is it to not stamp on a plastic bottle before you put it in your bin? Because you're basically paying people to take away air. If you haven't stamped on that bottle, there's less plastic you can fit into that bin or into that case. But that sense of responsibility for the waste that we produce, which is not limited, of course, to villages in the Carpathian Mountains, but is equally true of, here my neighbours in the building I'm speaking to in Budapest, they can't be bothered. Often the other flats in this block of flats, 10 flats, some of them can't be bothered to differentiate between one kind of waste and another, to put them in separate bins. So there's the mentality issue, but I think it's, again, as we were talking about earlier, it's a question of somehow taking response, of being aware and being willing to make time to think about the impact we have on the world, which is true whether one lives in, the most rural or the most urban environment. I have a friend in Hust in Transcarpathia who lives on a farm. He's actually French, but married to a Hungarian-Ukrainian or a Ukrainian-Hungarian. The first thing he took me to see that he's pretty proud of on his farm was his compost toilet. One of my sons, Mate, who lives in Scotland, he's a carpenter. He's very proud of his compost toilet. He builds compost toilets for his friends. He's, as people who get interested in the subject, it's easy to get obsessed with compost toilets because we're taking responsibility for the plastic and the waste we're using. We're taking responsibility for what we eat. But what about taking responsibility as well for our toilet systems? That's a pretty major. If we think about those villages around Lake Balaton now who are building frantically or giving permits to developers to build unnecessary houses there, how much water are they going to need? What's going to happen to the sewage there? What responsibility is involved in all of that? So I think one thing that is more positive in the modern world, I think people are more and more aware of this, especially the younger generations. I think younger people have a lot of things to teach their parents about responsibility. It's good that in schools, I'm sure people like you are giving talks in schools, teaching young people, summer camps, the whole pet cup idea. I think that message is getting home, and we don't need to begin at a sort of international level, these giant international conferences with the goals they set. That's all very well, but if we can't sort out, minimize our consumption, eat more locally grown vegetables, then we can't look to the capital cities and the United Nations to solve these problems. Researching my Carpathian book, a farmer in a town called Kopsamare, Nagy Kapusz, in the Kukulefeld, the area near the Fogaras Mountains in Romania, in Transylvania, said to me that when you go into a restaurant, if you're lucky enough to have enough money to afford a meal in a restaurant, the first question you as a restaurant guest should be asking is, where does this food come from? Was it locally sourced? Have these tomatoes had to travel 2,000 kilometers? Because in which case maybe I won't choose the tomatoes on the menu. Why am I eating tomatoes in December anyway? Why am I not eating potatoes or carrots in December? We need a much more responsible public. We need to consume less, and we need to consume more thoughtfully and think through all these things. And I think that huge progress is being made in all of this, but nowhere near enough, and not fast enough. And it's just all about, how we live on this planet, really.
Here I have to tell all the audience that we made a 1-hour documentary about Béla Franz in Yasinia, and you can find the link in the description. The title is The River Saver Truck, because he's a truck with which he collects the waste was bought via a crowdfunding or crowdsourcing campaign.
And it's a marvellous truck. I remember him showing me the truck as well. And he drives it, I think, once a week or twice a week to Ivano-Frankivsk to take waste that he has collected to places that will recycle glass, paper, plastic, and so on. So the tip of the iceberg, as ever, but very important.
Yeah, and we found the same, that if we start the cleanup and we put everything in order at the source of the rivers, up in the mountains, we can perfectly clean up the river basin from up to the bottom. And it starts at Béla, continues here in Budapest, and we will visit the next sections in the next few months, thanks to our Interreg Aquatic Plastic project.
Yeah, it's time for a short spot.
Aquatic Plastic is brought to you by the Interreg Danube region program, co-funded by the European Union. Operating within the world's most international river basin, the Aquatic Plastic Danube region Interreg project unites 33 organizations spanning 10 countries. Together we are executing 19 pilot actions and developing 8 solutions aimed at preventing, reducing and managing plastic pollution in the natural waterways of the Danube River Basin. How do we navigate through such diverse borders? Explore further by delving into our report and begin following our journey on LinkedIn and other social media platforms. In 2 minutes we give a feedback on how we proceed. We call Gudrun Obersteiner on the shores of River Wien and the Danube, of course, to tell us about monitoring microplastic pollution.
So hello Gudrun, here we are at Boku.
Hello, nice to have you here.
Very nice to talk to you. And the big question is that how can you make these all small particles that drive people crazy, microplastics, visible?
Yeah, this is really the big question, because this starts, it's not only on how to make it visible. First of all, we have to catch it. So those very, very small particles, they are in this very huge river Danube, and we have to filter it out. And there, at the moment, we try to find out the best methodology how to filter this microplastic out of the Danube. It's really those small particles, and it should somehow be representative. So you can imagine, just think about, you have a swimming pool and find there the microplastic, and this is almost impossible. And we have to find it in the Danube River, taking, for example, some nets, putting it in the water, and then try to find out, is there something, some microplastic parts within these nets stuck somewhere? Or the other possibility is to use a pump system where we have several filters so that we don't get all the big particles in the river, but can focus on the smaller particles. And also other possibilities like using a sedimentation box or something like that. So this is the first step. And then we have an amount of something, including perhaps, if we are lucky, some microplastic particles, but also some small leaves and some other material. And then in the laboratory, the first step is to pick out the microplastic particles. This could be done by hand picking under the microscope, but there are also some, of course, and luckily we have the possibility to use some methodologies that we can destroy the organic substances with some chemical and some methodologies, so that at the end of the day we only have the microplastic, or more or less we only have the microplastic, and then we can put this on specific filters, put it under the microscope, have some other chemical methodologies where we can really also define those very small particles, saying, oh, this is PET, this is coming from a PET bottle, for example, or from some other material.
Yeah, PET bottle is the good old traditional plastic bottle.
Yes.
But there is a hope that by the end of this process you will have something that others can use as a reference or as a guideline how to get started, because otherwise no policies, no recommendations from the EU, from the UN, or from any other body are legitimate or eligible.
At least at the moment, not for the regular monitoring process. We know the methodologies in general, we know it on a scientific level, but we really don't know what to recommend if you have to do something every week or every month and so on, because this has to be, I just call it, cheap enough. You cannot do the high sophisticated scientific sample performance when you don't have the money. So it has to be something that works also if you are not equipped with a lot of money.
There is a term for that, MVPs, like minimal viable products that are viable, that are produce results. And
what we therefore also do, because in Tidy Up and a lot of studies at the moment focus on measuring in water, perhaps it turns out during the aquatic plastic project it's the best idea not to spend so much time measuring in water, but just to have a look at the animals, at the biota, just to look at the mussels, at the fish. Perhaps they can tell us much more in a shorter time, with less equipment, with spending not that much money, than to go for the representative sampling in the water. Or perhaps we will look at the sediments. I think I can exclude the sediments, but they seem to be much more complicated to get representative results than to have sampling in water. But with the animals, with the biota, to have their perfect mixture. And so this we will try to find out if there are solutions beside measuring microplastic in water.
Thank you very much. And just a little insight into what comes next, because in aquatic plastics, things happen fast. We are in the first year of the project, at the beginning of the first year. And I know already that you are about to organize some workshops, and in a very prestigious or emblematic location.
Yes. We are very happy that we can have our workshops. So for all the partners of aquatic plastic who want to do their own microplastic sampling, we will go to our so-called river lab. This is really a very huge lab near the river Danube, where they can get a huge amount of real Danube water, but in the lab. So you have a lab in the Danube River. So you can do everything that you want to do under laboratory conditions, but still have the real Danube water. So it's really perfect for everything we want to try, we want to show, to have the different sampling methodologies, really one beside the other, looking what are the results. So I'm really very glad that we can show this to all.
What I can promise is that we will give a feedback about this workshop, and also we will keep a close eye on the developments of the microplastic working group. Thank you very much, Gudrun.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. That was Gudrun Obersteiner from the shores of River Wien and the Danube, of course. And we are back to our guest, Nick Thorpe. Still sticking to river literacy and magical realism, for that matter. In your Danube book, you visualize long-gone people with a few simple words. Lehár, the composer, sitting at a table of Café Sperl, I hope I pronounce it well, in Vienna, or Johannes Kepler, strolling the bridges on the Danube at Regensburg. They seem to me at least surprisingly alive, thanks to you. But how you personally are able to make this connection to figures of the past?
I've always been very interested in history. I love history, and I think history teaches us a great deal. And I write my books in the present tense as well, because I think that helps bring things alive. If we're just writing about the past all the time, then that it makes it harder for a reader today to engage with. So, and I think I'm always surprised by how willing people are to tell their stories. You know, there's a woman in Dunafertvar in Hungary who I just met 5 minutes before or 10 minutes before. I discovered, you know, she starts telling me about, you know, the very extreme experience for her of childbirth and how she nearly died in you know, as she was giving birth to her child, and that. So I think to be a writer, to be a traveller for that matter, one needs to. The nature of storytelling is to bring people from the past as well as the present alive, and to know how to, or to train oneself to listen. We're all so narcissistic nowadays, where it's all about me, about us expressing our who we are, what we want, how we're feeling today, and there's not enough kind of listening going on, and I think and so when I'm writing about history, I don't want to write about, you know, I'm just wondering how Kepler felt when he crossed that bridge. I'm wondering how the guys in the cafe in Vienna, you know, as they sipped their coffee or watched the other people or looked out through the window at the rain, the endless rain falling in the city, which I'm very familiar with. You know, some of my happiest memories of England as a child are of the rain and of, you know, ignoring my classes and looking out through the windows of classrooms and seeing the rain drumming on it and wondering if I could catch a glimpse of my mother walking past the school window on her way to shop, and whether I dared sort of lift my hand and wave at her, whether she'll spot me in the class of small children in the class, things like that. I mean, this sense of us all wanting, as listeners to stories, as consumers of stories, but also as storytellers in our own right, ourselves as messengers telling other people's stories that we repeat, and maybe the stories change a little bit as they get repeated, but that doesn't matter either. You know, there are always different versions of different myths and legends. So you know, for me, as a man of words, if I can call myself that, I love the etymology of words, the ring of words. I love learning other new languages. And learning the language of the river, of the Danube, and the people that live beside it is, and now with the mountain book, with the Carpathian book, you know, all those little streams flowing down, the sound of a stream as it goes over a stony bank, the sort of gurgling and glugging of water, the dew in the early morning up in the mountain pastures, the Polonina and the high Carpathians in Slovakia and Romania and Ukraine. All these things are, I don't know, we need to find time to remember those things. There's a beautiful poem by W.H. Davies in English. He wrote a book called Autobiography of a Supertramp. But he has a poem which goes something like, what is this life if full of care we have no time to stand and stare? To stand and stare beneath the boughs, and stand and stare like sheep or cows, or something. To get into the mind of a cow or of a sheep, looking silently, munchingly across a meadow. When I was travelling the Danube, especially on the Hungarian stretch by bicycle, I found myself talking to a lot of shepherds. And shepherds are very lonely characters normally. No one ever talks to them, really, partly because they've got quite fierce dogs. And if you walk close to them, the dogs start barking, or if you're really unlucky, start tearing you apart. But also, it's hard to imagine stopping your car, getting out of the car and walking over and striking up a conversation with a shepherd who by nature is walking 15 or 20 kilometers a day with his 800 sheep and dealing with the problems of sheep, cutting their toenails one by one. And by the time he's finished cutting the toenails of 800 sheep, he's got to start again because the others have, these are not everyday professions nowadays. And but I just found shepherds who, having got off my bike, slowly started walking across fields towards them. They would then call off their dogs because they hadn't talked to someone for a few days, and one would share a bottle of water. Unfortunately, I don't smoke. Most shepherds do smoke. They would stop and roll a cigarette, and one would spend, pass the time of day with shepherds who, as in the poem, spend a lot of time standing and staring. They can see the weather coming days in advance. One of my sons, my oldest son, Shamu, Sam, is a captain on sailing boats, and part of his training to have the responsibility of taking sailing boats across the ocean was to learn to tell the weather without any equipment. Obviously, one has a lot of equipment on a small sailing boat nowadays in the Pacific or Atlantic or Indian Ocean, but just that sense of, looking at the clouds, sniffing the wind, seeing where the weather's coming from and what it's going to do next. We do still live on, this is a small planet. It shouldn't be too difficult to navigate by the stars, to know what the wind is telling us, what the rivers are telling us. The people are using this book. I've met cyclists, and long-distance travelers themselves who paid me the honor of, when they're trying to minimize the luggage that they're carrying, cycling for day after day, week after week, sometimes upwind, against the wind. And some of them I've met, have been carrying a copy of my book as a sort of guide. But of course, cyclists are normally going downriver because the wind is coming from the west mostly. So they had the wind at their back at least. But nevertheless, I was honored that they were carrying my book with them in their precious and minimalist luggage. And one thing with the Danube, I wanted to say something has happened recently with the book, which is that it's just appeared in Italian, and I'm very excited about the Danube being published. It's already published in English, in German, in Polish, in Hungarian, in Hebrew, and now the latest translation is into Italian. It took them a long time, Keller Editore, in the north of Italy to publish it. It took a few years to translate, but now it's published. And you said nice things about it at the beginning. It's a kind of Bible of the Danube. The previous Bible of the Danube was, of course, Claudio Magri's Danube book. And I was very happy to hear that my publisher in Italy, Keller, had given Claudio Magri, had sent him a copy of my Danube, and that he's enjoying reading it, and they're cooking up a plan. I hope it will happen for Claudio Magri and I to meet in Trieste, perhaps in the autumn of this year, and he would talk about his Danube. I would talk about mine, and we would have a little sort of love-in about the Danube in Trieste, this kind of ancient Italian writer and this not quite so ancient British writer, who both of us coming from countries which the Danube does not touch, sort of talking about, our love affair with this river. So I'm looking forward to that very much. I hope it happens.
Talking of books, we are with Gary co-authors of, well, not really a book, it's rather a hand guide.
It's just a hand guide. It's not a proper book, but we wrote that hand guide to give help to people who are river savers, river lovers, NGOs, decision makers, family people, children, adults, for everybody who would like to clean up their rivers and don't know how to start it. So basically it's a step-by-step guide how we can save our rivers.
Surprise, the title is Aquatic Plastic.
Yes. Like the... Yeah, actually I was working on my presentation last weekend at Canva, and I used artificial intelligence, and I give a few keywords to the Canva and aquatic plastic, and it gives me very, very interesting solutions and pictures about what is aquatic plastic and what is ocean literacy is. It was really shocking and motivational. So, yeah, maybe I will send you a few pictures about it, how our book names and our most important definitions looks like from the perspective of artificial intelligence.
And this book is not so strong at literacy like yours, but we have a quote from Mark Twain saying, "The river has great wisdom and whispers its secrets to the hearts of man and woman," of course. And so hereby we just sign you this book, and we will send it to you by post, because as you realized, to reduce our carbon footprint, we make all our podcasts from a distance. So we are not there actually where you are, Nick. And we just hope that you will take a look at this book. So before saying goodbye, we have a little game. We've never played this game before, but I hope you will get the hang of it, and please participate. The game I want to suggest is that when I say island, then you say the name of an island.
The name of
and then you can challenge me with another. Okay, so what comes to you? And you don't have to explain. If somebody is interested, then he or she can look it up. Mm-hmm. But I'm just very interested in, what do you have, the first island that comes to you? Margaret Island. Unique.
Atacali.
Now you ask.
Source.
Of course, the Black Tissa in the Carpathians.
The White Tissa, which I've never seen but would love to see.
The same with me. Now your question.
Tree.
Oak for boat building.
Pine, like in the Transcarpathians.
A dish of fish by the river.
Catfish.
Yeah, me too. We talked a lot about catfish.
Okay, now it's okay.
Boat.
The Kossuth, an old paddle steamer anchoring at the Landsbridge.
The Tatabánya, a steamship which was restored carefully by Hungarian boat enthusiasts, then sold and sank. After its journey, it actually sank in the Black Sea, having gone all the way down the Danube.
That brings... Oh, no, I don't interrupt. Now you come. A boat. After the boat. Question boat.
Gold.
Okay, the Skoda. the Skoda car that guy bought from the gold piece that he found in the river Danube. So Skoda, the car Skoda. It's in the book. The gold. About the gold. What comes to your mind, Gabby? It's a tricky question.
Just the fool's gold.
The fuse gold. Yeah. Or the cyanide pollution.
Yeah.
Yeah, oh my God. Yeah. Okay, now I come with the tricky question. Color of the river.
Silver.
Gray.
For you, Nick, like the downstream Danube, right? That's silver.
Yeah, I mean, I remember several places on the river which were silver when I came through. Once in Serbia, once at Vidin in Bulgaria. When you look at the river and it's silver, though sometimes it can even be black, occasionally blue.
Sailor.
Szatmári László, a ferryman on the river Bodrog. He's one of the very few who is able to tell amazing stories, full of river literacy. Amazing, well.
A man, an African, I saw once up on the bridge of a big seagoing boat in the Danube Delta, somewhere near Tulcea, where the big ships with a deep draft can still go up a little way up the Danube there. And I remember looking up, I was passing on the boat from Tulcea to Sulina. Actually, it was nearer Sulina where I saw this. And just seeing, as someone who lived only for half a year once in Africa, I'm always intrigued by Africans far away from home, how they feel towards the Danube and towards their rather lonely life, the small number of people on those big merchant shipping boats, and just looking up as we passed very close to this boat and waving to an African guy up on this big cargo ship somewhere near Sulina in the Delta. So he was a sailor, not a traditional sailor with a sail, because of course it's actually, sadly, it's not possible to sail on the Danube. In most places, the regulations do not allow sailing boats. Although I do have a Finnish friend, Jędrek, who's actually Polish originally, who's a great sailor, and he's sailed around the world several times. He's not a young man anymore, but he said to me once that we should sail the Danube together. Imagine sailing in a small catamaran from Budapest down to the Delta. That would be amazing.
I agree, and hereby I recommend you a Hungarian book named as The Pirate on the Danube, Kalóz a Dunán. It was written in the 60s by a man who sailed the complete Danube with a kalóz, a very small dinghy, but it's a sailboat from source to the Black Sea. It's a great book. I loved it, every word, so I will try, and I will send it to you by post with the book Aquatic Plastic. Thank you, Nick. I think we got what we wanted. We squeezed you really cruelly. Sorry for that.
It didn't hurt too much. Thank you, Geri and Dati, very much. It was I enjoyed the conversation.
Thank you, guys. This is the end of our program. You have listened to Nick Thorpe. We spoke about many amazing things, from his previous book to his next book. And now a short spot on the Transnational River Cleanup Challenge.
Please listen, watch, subscribe, like and comment. We would love to hear your feedback. This was the first episode of Aquatic Plastic.
The Transnational River Cleanup Challenge is a show. The guests of the show will take part in the Transnational River Cleanup Challenge, an international quest for the most inspiring examples for how rivers can be kept healthy and clean.
In the next program, we are going to listen to Ian Davies, a co-founder of the Tisza Tidy Up initiative.
Till then, be loud and clear and keep your rivers and seas clean. Aquatic Plastic is out.